Morning, St. Alphonsus Parish, and all of the people, friends, relatives, interesting people in this topic, and other Redemptorists who are also paying attention. Thank you for spending some time with us today as we continue this discussion about spirituality and learning who we are as authentic spiritual beings who experience our spirituality in our humanity. In a very real sense, what we're doing is we're celebrating the incarnation. We're celebrating that central tenet, if you will, of Christianity, that God, in the person of Jesus, becomes one of us, becomes man. I'm going to today start going through some necessary basics to help us widen our discussion and appreciate our understanding of this topic. And before I start this, let me make what is obviously a comment that you've probably thought of already for yourselves, and that is that this is an introduction. It's by no means complete. As I said the first day, I'm by no means an expert. There's other people who can offer wonderful insight. And then, of course, there is the authenticity of your own human experience, which speaks to your spiritual journey, which speaks to what is important to you, what you see, how you react, what your challenges might be. So all that is necessary to acknowledge, and I think also to be appreciative of, to be thankful for. The other thing I would like to say is I'm going to use the word this morning that I've chosen as a way to perhaps understand what I'm talking about, but it's an incomplete word. In fact, any word I choose would be incomplete. There's no way to describe adequately the immensity, if you will, of spirituality, the immensity of God's grace at work in our lives. But we have to use something, and so I'm going to use the word connect, and I'm also going to use the word disconnect. But I'd like to point out, as you might already understand and know, even though I'll use the word disconnect, it's really not possible to disconnect from your spiritual self. It's not possible for a human person to disconnect from God. It's possible to disconnect from a small idea of God. It's possible to disconnect from even an official explanation of who God is. But it's not possible to disconnect from God, because God is in everything, in all things. And it doesn't matter what words you use for God, or how you understand God, or you don't understand God. It is impossible as a human being to disconnect. In a Christian sense, we're reminded of what St. Paul tells us when he reminds us that it is in God, in the Spirit of God, that we live, that we move, that we have our being. So the life that we have, the coverage of all those things that are important to us, the discovery of all those things that are necessary for us, our experiences, good, bad, indifferent, everything that we are as human beings is not generated by us. It comes to us as, again, from the Christian point of view, which is by no means the only point of view, but from the Christian point of view, it comes to us as gift. So we really can't disconnect, but we can distract ourselves enough to not pay attention to what is important. And so I'll use that distraction, that experience of not being connected. I'll say that we're disconnected. But no, again, what I'm really saying is you can't disconnect. You can disconnect your awareness. You can disconnect your focus. Just as, and this is the more positive way, you can connect. You can become awake. You can become aware. You can become filled and blessed and nourished in ways that you can't even begin to imagine when you begin to pay attention to what is around you. So today we're going to talk about how people routinely connect to the experience of God, no matter how they understand God to be. I, in some places, have used the word the divine other. Sometimes I'll use the word divine mystery. Sometimes I'll use the word God. It doesn't matter. All of them are incomplete. It's just a connection with that life-giving force, or whatever word you want to use, that permeates the universe, that permeates who we are, and that our consciousness somehow understands is necessary for us. And so the invitation is already there. So I'm going to talk about connecting, and I'm going to talk about different points, different ways that a person can connect. And again, what this is going to do is it's going to show the inadequacies of the human language. Because the only way that I can speak to you is one thought at a time. And hopefully it's a clear thought, and hopefully it makes sense. But I can only provide one thought at a time. And so when I choose to discuss the first thing I'm going to choose, that doesn't necessarily mean that it holds primacy over everything else. It just means that it's the first thing. When I choose the second thing, it doesn't mean the second thing or the third thing. And in fact, what I'm going to do is talk about 6 particular connecting points. So it doesn't mean that you have to perfect number 1 before you can experience number 6. No, it doesn't mean that at all, because in the way people live, they connect with this experience in many different ways. At the same time, there is something that is more rudimentary about the experience of number 1 that might be, in comparison, more profound when you compare it to number 6. It might seem that way, but when all is said and done, they're all just points of awareness, points of connection. So instead of thinking about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, perhaps think about it as a circle. And think about yourself in the middle of the circle, experiencing connections at some time in your life, a connection that's extremely strong. At other times of your life, a connection that you might not even be aware of. But eventually, as you try to integrate your spiritual self, you become aware of all the different points, all the different connections, and all the connections that I'm not going to talk about that are in between the ones that I'm going to illustrate for your purposes. So the entire journey, if you will, the entire experience. So you have to start somewhere, and I'm going to start where the Catechism of the Catholic Church starts. And the reason that I choose to begin where the Catechism of the Catholic Church begins is because the only tradition that I can speak of with any sort of authority, if there is such a thing as authority, is within the Catholic Church tradition. That's the tradition that I know best. It's the tradition that I was raised in. It's the tradition that I represent as a priest. So I'm going to speak a lot about the Christian tradition, and specifically at times about the Catholic expression of the Christian tradition. But I do so understanding that it is only one tradition. It's a tradition that's important to me. It's a tradition that I think is life-giving and essential, at least for my spiritual journey. And I understand that it is for many other people. But I also understand that there's literally billions of people for whom the Christian message is not something that's life-giving. It's something that they barely know anything about. But even if that's the case, which we know that it is, they too nevertheless experience the same forms, the same experiences of connection with the sacred. They just use different words for it and have different experiences, different practices and different disciplines. I've been told, I've never been part of a conversation like this before, but I've been told that the people who come from all sorts of different traditions and who have a tendency to be more contemplative in their outlook can gather together and have a conversation, and there's more points of convergence than there is points of disagreement, as opposed to people who are clerical, who are highly representative of their particular tradition and closed in on their particular tradition, who enter together into a conversation, and the conversation is confrontational. Like I said, I've never experienced that, but it does make a little bit of sense to me. So perhaps it's true. Nevertheless, in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, the Catechism, quoting the Second Vatican Council, makes a profound statement. This is what it says. For if humans exist, it is because God has created them through love, and through love continues to hold them in existence. So central to the Church's teaching on who we are as spiritual people is the fact that we're human beings, created human beings, and that we're created by God. And that it is God who holds us in existence. That is a profound statement to make. And it's not an easy statement to make. And the meaning of that statement has changed from the day that it was first written up into including today. It doesn't mean the same as it meant 50 years ago when it was first written. What do I mean? What I mean is that there was at least the possibility that in most of the Western world, and for people who are watching this particular expression of me trying to talk about spirituality, that we're part of the Western world and Western culture, for most people in the Western world, when that statement was made, the working assumption was that most people were people of faith. Most people believed in God. Most people within the Western tradition operated out of some sort of religious tradition. Normally it was Catholic or Christian, and almost everyone experienced God in some way and lived that tradition. How things have changed. We can no longer assume within our Western world that the most of the people, in fact, believe in God. We know that many do not. So when we say that God has created us through love and God continues to hold us in existence, that is a statement that is not necessarily accepted by many people. There are many people who would say that that is not true, that it's a fairy tale, that it's ridiculous. So our spirituality and our spiritual journey, because we are people of faith and because we are people who hold to live life within the Christian tradition, this is an important statement to make. We believe in God. We believe that God has created us, and we believe that God holds us in existence. We acknowledge the fact that not everybody does believe in that. But it is something that animates us, it's something that energizes us, and it's something that gives us life. It also, when we talk about our spirituality, it also defines us. Because if you believe in God, then your spiritual journey is going to be a journey in search of relationship with the God that you believe in. So you're going to search for an experience of God. You're going to search for something within that experience and within that relationship that rings true within the human tradition, that rings true within the religious tradition that you're part of. And that should be no surprise to us, because that's how we as human beings function. It's how we as human beings live. For Catholics, indeed for all Christians, and not only for Christians, but for Jewish people, and also for Muslim people, there's one ancestral person that we traditionally look to for the beginning of our faith. And that ancestral person that we look to is Abraham. I'll tell you from the very beginning that it is not a one-man show with Abraham. If you pay attention to the story, in reality, it is the search of two people, Abraham and Sarah. But since the story is written for us from a patriarchal point of view, Abraham gets the biggest play. But if you pay attention to the story, Abraham and Sarah are pretty much in this together, and they're searching together. So since this is the foundational ancestral experience for us, let's look and see what Abraham and Sarah discover, what they're doing, and what does it teach us for ourselves, our own spiritual journey, how we can connect with God. First of all, it teaches us that Abraham and Sarah acknowledge the presence of God. Again, like I said, that's something that you can't take for granted. But in Abraham and Sarah's time, everybody believed in God. They believed in many gods. Everybody had a god. They were gods of all different shapes and forms. There were gods of the mountains. There were gods of the sky. There were gods of battle. There were God of love. There was God of war. There was God of everything that you could possibly imagine. And among the nomadic peoples, there was a profound interest, not only in the many gods, but there was a profound interest in the one God. Not the one God to be understood as that there are no other gods. That's not the biblical understanding of what one God means. The one God means your God. So Abraham and Sarah are in a culture within a context of life and of living in which there are many gods. But they do not have, or at least they feel that they do not have, a personal God. Someone that will take care of them, take care of their family, provide for them, protect them. Why don't they feel like this? Why have they, in the midst of their entire life, and the scripture tells us that they're wealthy, they have herds, they have flocks, they can do pretty much whatever they want. Why are they possessed with this idea that they do not have a personal family God who protects them? It's because they're missing one thing. And within a patriarchal society, what they're missing is essential. They're missing an heir. They're missing a son. Someone who can take over everything, who can continue the family line, who can guarantee, if you will, the family business. That person is missing. So Abraham and Sarah are in search of a God who will provide them with what they need the most. Provide them with an heir. By the time we meet Abraham and Sarah, they've obviously been on this journey for a long time, because the scripture tells us they're very old. And up until this time, even though they've enjoyed continued wealth and success and protection and all the other things that a nomadic person might want, they have not been able yet to find a God who will be their God. But one day that changes. And Abraham and Sarah find God. They find their family God in the person of, as we learn later, the person of Yahweh. How is this family God made manifest to them? Well, it's no surprise, and this is the first thing that we learn in the spiritual journey. They discover the God that they're looking for. They don't discover a God that they're not looking for. They discover a God who represents them, who images them, who captures for them everything that they consider to be important and necessary. And because they're people of a patriarchal society, and they live from the perspective of a patriarchal society, the highest authority that they can imagine is that of a patriarch. So it should be no surprise that when they discover Yahweh, they discover another patriarch. Yahweh comes across very much as a patriarch. Not only does Yahweh come across as a patriarch, he comes across as a patriarch that's acting in the same way Abraham and Sarah is. Because Yahweh's looking for something also. Yahweh's looking for a people. He's looking for someone who will serve him. And he wants someone who will claim him as their own. And so you have both of them in need, both of them in desire, both of them wanting to be in relationship. But at first, when we meet them, they're both kind of a little bit wary of each other. They're really not sure. Abraham's not sure if Yahweh's the one. Him and Sarah aren't sure. And Yahweh's not quite sure, it seems, that Abraham and Sarah are the one. Abraham asked Yahweh to produce. And Yahweh has to produce what Abraham and Sarah want more than anything else. He has to produce a son. And so Yahweh says to Abraham, I will give you a son. Not only will I give you a son, through my gift of you as a son, I will give you lands, nomadic lands, people, everything that you can Basically, what Yahweh tells Abraham is, you've just won the biggest Powerball that exists in the universe. It's all yours. The biggest thing that you could possibly offer a nomad. But there's a condition. And the condition is, you will serve me and only me. I will be your God, and you will be my people. But I am a jealous God. There is no other gods, only me. So Abraham and Sarah have to go back, and they have to figure out if this is the deal that they want. And the story tells us that it is, that they do want this relationship, that it is important for them, that it is necessary for them, and they're willing to make the choices, and they're willing to make the decisions that are necessary in order to enable this relationship. And so they enter into a relationship with Yahweh, and the story is fascinating in the twists and the turns that take place. But by the end of the story, we have the heir, we have the son, the keeper of the promise, and we have the beginning of the relationship, the covenant that will sustain the people of Israel from that moment on. It's interesting that in the story of Abraham, as I mentioned, Abraham and Sarah, that the Jewish and the Christian traditions share the same story. The Muslim tradition is a little bit different. In the Muslim tradition, Abraham is discovered not as an old man, but as a young man. And he's also discovered as a young man who is convinced from the very beginning of his life that there is only one God. So his search, which is different than the search from Abraham and Sarah's, is not a search for a God that will be favorite to him and to his family. His search is for the only God, the one God. If you pay attention to the biblical story, there's nothing in the biblical story that suggests that the other gods of all the other peoples need to be sacrificed in the Jewish Christian tradition before Abraham can accept Yahweh. Yahweh accepts the other gods. He only demands that they remain loyal to him. In the other tradition, the Muslim tradition, there are no other gods. There are only the one God. And one should not be surprised by that, because that's the major thrust of theology. So what does that teach us in our spiritual journey? What does that tell us about our own experience? Well, the first thing that it tells us is, and I think this is important, when we begin to seek for God, when we begin to pay attention to the experience of God, when we try to fill that sense of journey within ourselves, that sense of desire within ourselves, we should not be surprised that the God that we discover is very familiar to us. It's going to be a God that is a God that we have created in our own imagination. That is the God that we will discover. And it seems that God is okay with that, is all right with that. The other thing that we're going to discover in the beginning of our relationship with God is that, and this is something that the saints are just flabbergasted about, God is also seeking us. So it's not a one-way street. Abraham and Sarah's story tells us that not only were they seeking God, it also tells us that God was seeking them, which is very important. Another thing that the story tells us is that God accepts you in the spiritual journey exactly as you are at the moment that you enter into a relationship. He doesn't demand that you change. He doesn't demand that you all of a sudden let go of everything. He accepts you exactly as you are. And together, as God and as creature, you grow in the relationship. And the relationship changes. And as we mentioned the other day, the skills of relationship are essential in the skills of the spiritual journey also with your relationship with God. You're going to grow in your relationship with God in the same way that you grow in a relationship with anyone else. Look at your current relationships today. Look at someone that you've been in a relationship with for, let's say, 20 years. That person is not the original person that you fell in love with. The person is completely different. There's things about that person that you never knew that you now know. There's shared experiences that you never could have imagined and that you now have in common with each other. There's joys, there's sorrows, there's ups, there's downs, probably more sideways than anything else. But it's a dynamic, growing relationship. And if you look at your relationship now that you have 20 years in, and you try to imagine what it would have been like 20 years ago if you would have chosen that relationship, chances are you wouldn't have. The relationship that it is now is not what you imagined it to be. It's not what you thought it would be. It's not what attracted you. But there was just enough at the very beginning of the relationship to make you take the first step, to make you trust, to make you enter into that relationship, to enter into the invitation that the relationship offered to you, and to begin the journey of excitement together, the journey of life. And that's what it is in our experience of God. The other thing, and I know that as you're listening, you can figure this out for yourself, the relationship has to grow. It has to develop. You can't abandon it. It's not enough to simply say yes and then never tend to it, never pay attention to it, never experience it as something new and as vibrant. Because if that happens, 20 years from now, you're going to look at that person, that God you're in a relationship with, and you're going to say, who are you? How did I ever end up with you? You're not the person that I wanted. This is not what I signed up for. And all of that's true because we change. The relationship changes. Everything about it has a new dynamic and a new energy. So the initial connecting point is important, but it's not the end of the story. It's only the beginning of the story. And the adventure continues from the beginning onward. So this week, we've gone a long way. We've started the very beginning on Monday, and we've come all this way to the first connecting point, and we started talking about our relationship and reminding ourselves the importance of Abraham and Sarah in our journey. Next Monday, we'll continue our discussion, and since next week is Holy Week, we'll only have our discussion Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. We'll not have it during the Triduum on Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday because the liturgies of Holy Week are of paramount importance, and that's where our attention and our focus should be. So we'll just meet next Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday at 10:15 and continue with our journey. Have a great weekend, and I'll see you next week. God bless.